First episode opens with a small light piercing through complete darkness. Tim, a young boy we haven't met before, runs down the pitch-black hallways of the Down Deep with a lit torch in hand. One of the surrounding walls bears symbols of anger and resistance. People have graffitied over a floor-to-ceiling "Thank the Founders" propaganda display with the words "Liars" and "Truth Now." Once Tim reaches a large group of adults, he delivers a vital message from engineering. In 15 minutes, the silo's generator will flood. Backed into a corner by a ticking clock, this band of rebels makes a last-ditch assault against the silo's leadership, who have sequestered themselves behind armed guards on one of the upper levels. Many civilians fall to the security team's bullets before the former overwhelms the latter into surrender. Every surviving civilian, young Tim included, marches free of the silo and into the outside world, waving a victorious green flag all the while. Once this brief prologue fades to black, we return to Juliet as she slowly crosses the distance between her silo and its closest neighbor, passing a battered green flag and navigating through the thousands of skeletons littering the ground. These corpses belong to the people we just saw charging out of their silo with such fervent hope. Without a functioning environmental suit, the toxic air felled them mere minutes after they won their freedom. Even the corridor leading into the silo is so cramped with bodies, Juliet must walk on top of them, maintaining her balance as dusty bones crunch beneath her booted feet. Once inside, it quickly becomes apparent that this abandoned building is no walk in the park. Frankly, neither was Juliet's silo, but hers was operational. Without electricity or an active population, this one is as dark and silent as an undisturbed crypt. Juliet herself nearly joins the corpses when her limited oxygen runs out. Suffocating underneath her helmet, which doesn't want to budge off her head, she shatters open the helmet's glass front with a nearby crowbar. Once Juliet starts wandering the silo's familiar paths, it doesn't take long for her to notice a distant clinking sound reminiscent of someone hammering metal on metal. No one responds to Juliet's calls, but she forges ahead toward the noise. The problem? There's an inconvenient chunk of walkway missing, one too large to safely jump across. Inspiration strikes after Juliet spots a body hanging off one of the railings from a rope. She hauls up both rope and body and commandeers the latter, tying one end to the railing and the other around her waist. She lowers herself down and tries to swing across the missing slab of walkway, but the rope snaps under her weight, careening her down into deep water, presumably from the flooded generator referenced in the episode's prologue. Juliet manages to drag herself back to solid ground, but not without letting loose an oddly satisfying scream. As Juliet keeps exploring, certain areas trigger flashbacks to her younger self, specifically her early days in mechanical, as she learns the ropes with her coworkers and grows closer to Martha Walker and Shirley Campbell. Both women deliver some hard truths about isolation, resilience, and humanity's innate need for community. In Walker's case, who already demonstrates a gruff but deeply maternal affection for Juliet, she relays a story about catching pneumonia. The worst part wasn't the symptoms, but the moment she woke up in the middle of the night and found herself alone. Terrified and panicking, Walker ran into the corridor and shouted for help. It was a relief when her neighbors responded, even though they were irritated about having their sleep interrupted. Shirley, meanwhile, once got a little too adventurous with a group of young friends. Together, they ventured down into one of the silo's lowest levels, only for the others to accidentally leave Shirley behind. Worse, they never came back for her, opting to leave her abandoned in the dark. Juliet, already well acquainted with societal exile in the wake of her mother Hannah dying by suicide, asks Shirley how she returned home. "I went really, really slowly," Shirley answers, "but I found my way." In the current timeline, Juliet finds her way by dropping a long strip of metal over the missing footpath section via a handmade rope pulley. It's a slow, perilous walk across, but a promising one, until the makeshift bridge gives, forcing Juliet to run, leap, and grab onto the opposite edge for dear life. Hauling herself up, Juliet enters the office and housing areas only to face another disappointment. That clinking sound is nothing more than an ID badge hanging off an active desk fan and bashing against its front. But a far eerier noise soon replaces it. music. Somehow, the dulcet tones of Audrey Hepburn crooning Moon River, a song made famous by the film Breakfast at Tiffany's, are coming from behind a giant metallic vault door. Naturally curious, Juliet tries to open the locked entrance without any luck. However, as soon as she turns away, a very alive voice greets her from inside. A metal eye-hole slot slides open to reveal a pair of wide, heterochromatic eyes staring out at Juliet. This stranger politely tells her that they understand why she's tempted to get inside, but they won't hesitate to kill her if she tries a second time. They snap the slot shut on Juliet's stunned face, and Silo's Season 2 premiere cuts to its end credits just as sharply. Out of the Silo's approximately 10,000 residents, no one is perhaps more shocked about Juliet's survival than Bernard Holland, the Silo's secret leader hiding in plain sight. Presumably, Holland thought that sentencing Juliet to death would solve the threat presented by her meddling curiosity. After all, condemning people to the toxic outside air is the easiest way to silence any problems. Instead, Holland's trusty plan literally shrivels up before his eyes as the man watches a live feed from the inside of Juliet's helmet. As Juliet approaches the other silo, both characters witness the swath of corpses covering the outside ground before Juliet enters the building, and Holland loses the video signal. Panicking, Holland opens a book called The Order. Its design and typography call to mind older printings of the Christian Bible, and flips to a specific section. In the event of a failed cleaning, the page heading reads, "Prepare for war." As if to confirm there's no turning back from the consequences of what Juliet has unleashed, a piercing alarm peals out over the silo's intercom, complete with flashing red lights for good measure. Holland races out of a private room and back to the main floor, while an automated voice orders all residents to return to their homes. With Holland's blessing, Robert Sims, the head of judicial security, institutes a strict curfew and circumvents protocol by seizing temporary control over the sheriff's deputies, effectively increasing his power and reach. Aptly enough, given this episode's title, maintaining order isn't as simple as Holland would like. Juliet's survival goes against everything the people have been taught to believe, and many lower-level inhabitants are angrily demanding answers. Others, like Knox, prefer to err on the side of caution, but they're outliers. Shirley Campbell, in particular, knows that something fishy is going on. Deputy Hank tries to calm the increasingly argumentative uproar, but when the cross-shouting reaches a fever pitch, it's Martha Walker who successfully shuts everyone down by blasting the crowd with a water hose. In no uncertain terms, she tells them to keep their mouths shut and their heads down, because public protesting puts a target on their backs. Later, in Walker's private quarters, Walker argues against Shirley's optimism. Juliet's survival is highly unlikely thanks to the environmental suit's limited oxygen supply, and Walker just wants to mourn my girl without a fuss. Shirley stands firm, offering a strong counterpoint. If a long-concealed truth is waiting to be discovered, then just grieving isn't enough. Right on cue, Hank interrupts their meeting and apologetically detains Walker for questioning. Down in the holding cells, the deputies are already holding Walker's ex-wife, Carla. If you'll recall from last season, every person who goes outside to clean reinforces their suit with heat tape. Carla and Walker kept Juliet alive by secretly swapping out the deliberately faulty tape provided by the silo with a high-quality kind exclusive to the mechanical division. Carla hasn't answered the deputies' questions, but she's willing to assume the sole blame and let Walker go free. Leadership must have realized how Juliet cheated death, and Carla's access to mechanical makes her the most likely suspect. But none of the evidence traces back to Walker. Walker refuses with the staunchness we've come to expect from her. In her mind, their deaths are inevitable, and this way, at least they go out together. Meanwhile, acting sheriff Paul Billings has reluctantly moved into Juliet's office. Sims assures Billings that the wisest, smartest path forward through this hubbub is to conduct business as usual. For Billings specifically, that includes writing his official report about Juliet's cleaning. Despite a rocky start, the more Juliet and Billings collaborated last season, the more conflicted Billings' loyalties became. Now, Billings doesn't seem to approve of Holland's curfew or believe Sims's testimony that Juliet chose to go outside. In her absence, the puzzle pieces aren't lining up. Those puzzle pieces grow more nefarious once a clearly floundering Holland visits Judge Meadows' quarters. Even though the air between these two is even frostier than usual, Holland asks Meadows to stand beside him when he addresses the silo. It's a necessary show of unity for an unprecedented situation, he argues. And to Holland's credit, he admits that he mistreated and underestimated Meadows years earlier when she worked as his shadow. The turning point seems to arrive when he promises Meadows anything she wants in return for her help. Meadows, choosing a clear mind over her normal inebriated state, pours all her alcohol down the kitchen sink before comparing herself to the Wizard of Oz, i.e., a fraud hiding behind glamorous lies. Craving the same freedom Juliet experienced, Meadows agrees to attend Holland's speech as long as he helps her safely leave the silo. Holland puts quite the political spin on the situation during said speech. He gets ahead of the truth by distorting it in his favor, crediting Juliet's survival to the silo, giving her a new kind of experimental tape. To sweeten the manipulation, he dubs this miraculous development a hopeful sign for their communal future. The majority of the listening crowd answers this placation with claps and cheers, a compliance Shirley can't abide. That night, she hosts a small resistance meeting, which Walker promptly crashes. The older woman tempers Shirley's idealism with some hard-earned wisdom, namely that leadership will wipe out everyone before they capitulate to their demands. Holland and co. are just waiting for a viable excuse to attack. If this brewing rebellion stands a chance, they need to act covertly. If you're wondering what changed Walker's mind, it seems to be a two-word graffiti slogan popping up on the walls. Juliet lives. Ultimately, the semantics of whether Juliet is still alive doesn't matter. If her influence inspires others to pursue the truth, then her spirit endures. And that's enough ammunition for an army. We open with shots of Silo 17, including the word lies written on the camera lens from outside, Juliet's suit, and her makeshift bridge. The man inside the vault asks Juliet about her name. When she gives it, he remarks that it's like the play. She's surprised he knows about Romeo and Juliet. The vault dweller wonders which silo Juliet is from. After all, there are 50 of them. Juliet pivots, asking who he is. He shuts the eye slit in the door. After a few seconds, he reopens it, introducing himself to Juliet as Solo. Solo asks Juliet how she wound up outside. Was she sent out to clean like Ron Tucker? Ron, like Juliet, also refused to clean. He was the one who wrote lies on the dirty lens. A few days after that, the fighting started. Then Russell, the head of IT, put Solo in the vault. Solo was his shadow. Russell instructed Solo not to let anyone inside the vault. Juliet wonders why everyone went outside, to which Solo responds that they all thought it was safe. They didn't see Ron die, so they assumed he was alive. It dawns on Juliet that this could happen to her silo. God, this moment is so beautifully layered. She realizes she needs a new suit to venture back outside. Meanwhile, in Silo 18, Teddy is arrested for writing the Juliet Lives graffiti. Afterward, his mother tearfully tells Shirley, Walk, Cooper, and the others that she's proud of Teddy for taking a bold stand. After all, the Down Deep is their home. They can mark the walls however they want. Shirley states those above will want to make an example of someone from Mechanical. However, she refuses to let that happen. Upstairs, Bernard shows Judge Meadows the server room. They discuss the order and how it states that a failed cleaning means they should prepare for war. Bernard adds that they've arrested a man from Mechanical for the graffiti. Most cameras below 120 have been knocked out, so Bernard had intel regarding said graffiti. The conversation pivots to Juliet. Meadows remarks that she didn't strike her as someone who would want to go outside. Bernard reveals Juliet was caught with a hard drive predating the rebellion. Bernard admits he didn't check to see what was on said hard drive beyond the 200-year-old cleaning Juliet shared with the silo. He destroyed it. Bernard claims Juliet said she wished to go out, but Meadows looks incredulous. She knows when Bernard is lying. Bernard reveals Juliet is heading towards Silo 17, but it's unlikely she'll survive there. That silo's been out of commission for a long time. Meanwhile, Juliet tries to find materials to assemble a new suit. She sees graffiti similar to what's in our silo. Ron Tucker lives, along with, "We want to go out." Bernard visits Robert, asking him if he's pulled aside those who might have seen the video Juliet shared on their computers. Robert reveals he plans to put them on the medication under the guise of treating their anxiety. Additionally, Patrick Kennedy and Danny Bly, who helped Juliet in the season 1 finale, are in judicial seclusion. Later, Robert visits Patrick Kennedy, who's not having a good time in judicial seclusion. Patrick demands to know why he's there. Robert proposes the memory-altering drug. Patrick's fine with taking it so long as it erases his memories from the past 25 years. He wants to forget his late wife Doris because the grief is too painful. Then, Sheriff Paul Billings stops by Meadows' place to discuss Juliet. Paul reveals that Robert and 4 of the raiders present insist that Juliet voiced her desire to go outside. He's about to interview the 5th one. Before Paul departs, he discloses his syndrome diagnosis. Meadows was aware of Robert making an allowance for Paul's illness. She believes it's a crucial step in breaking the stigma surrounding the syndrome. Meadows adds there's a theory circulating the silo that the syndrome is a natural, human reaction to an unnatural situation. She believes humans aren't meant to be cooped up underground. Later, Juliet returns to the vault door. Solo has left out a container of chicken stew. Juliet wolfs it down. She tells him that she doesn't have enough materials to make a suit. Solo replies that, in the past, the suits were assembled in room S, and the material is in critical supply. Unfortunately, that's underwater now. Solo changes the subject, asking Juliet why she didn't clean. After admitting she said she wouldn't, Juliet states why people clean. When they venture outside for the first and only time, they see blue skies, gorgeous trees, and birds flying overhead. Thus, they feel compelled to clean for those inside the silo. The underground dwellers must see what they're missing topside. However, it's merely footage the person sees in the camera in their helmet, not what the silo denizens see. The beauty is a lie. Juliet asks Solo about the bodies in the hall around the corner. She notes they don't look as old as those in the silo's entrance. What's up with that? Solo dodges the question, closing the eye slit again. Meanwhile, Robert recruits an ex-raider, one of the best sharpshooters out there, to work in mechanical. Be Robert's eyes and ears. Elsewhere, Knox scolds Cooper for disobeying his orders. Instead of spying on Shirley, Coop joined the cause. Next, Dr. Nichols meets a woman participating in the birth lottery made possible by Juliet's cleaning. Nichols reveals he's a parent. The woman asks for advice, which the good doctor dispenses. Before parting ways, they finally introduce themselves. Realizing he's Juliet's father, the woman offers condolences. Nichols smiles and wishes her good luck. Then, Solo suggests a firefighter suit for Juliet's trek outside. She could modify it. Juliet learns that fire equipment is on level 23 by recycling, so Juliet heads there, only to find it submerged in water. At the same time, Paul hands over his report on Juliet's cleaning to Meadows, which she asked to see before he submitted it. 4 of the 5 raiders who assisted in the apprehension of Juliet claimed she said she wanted to go outside. However, the 5th one stated she was too focused on her job, but would side with her coworkers. Paul informs Meadows that when he escorted Juliet up the stairs, she was adamant about staying put. Ultimately, Paul believes Juliet never wanted to venture outside the silo. Meadows reassures Paul that she'll take this from here before heading inside to watch recordings from long before the silo, back when humans could walk along the sandy shores of the beach. Meanwhile, Shirley and her crew storm the outside of the deputy's station in the Down Deep. Knox stands before it with Hank, bracing himself to block the door. He tries to get Shirley to turn around. This isn't who they are, he insists. Shirley and the group demand Teddy's release. Suddenly, Patrick hurls a firebomb at the station, setting it ablaze. This must be what Robert instructed him to do in exchange for wiping his memories of Doris. Robert's ex-raider buddy, who's standing by Hank, fires on Patrick. The bullet ricochets off a pipe and strikes Patrick and Cooper, who tried to prevent Patrick from throwing the firebomb to begin with. The crowd disperses. Shirley and Knox race toward Cooper, who's not doing well. They shout for medical help as Coop dies in their arms. After the incident, Hank contacts Paul, asking for his assistance. He needs Paul to join him in the down deep. There's too much unrest fomented by residents who want answers. Elsewhere, Shirley and Knox meet in a tunnel sans cameras. They're both grieving the loss of Cooper. Shirley punches the wall in a rage. Knox encourages her to punch him instead. She quickly delivers a blow to Knox's stomach. Knox insists he's on her side. He wants answers too. After all, Shirley isn't the only one who's lost Juliet. However, her way of getting answers won't fly. It'll get them all killed. This piques Shirley's curiosity. Knox gestures to the space below the floor, asking if she remembers when they explored down there as kids. He mentions the Wall of Names and how he finally understands what it means. Next, Bernard explains how he'll throw the silo denizens off the scent to allow Meadows to go outside without their knowledge. He insists she'll need her own suit. In fact, he'll do her measurements. He whips out cloth measuring tape and does just that. Bernard reveals that Teddy was released as per Meadows' suggestion. Showing mercy is the way to go. However, Meadows knows about the firebombing and the shooting that claimed 2 lives. Bernard insists he wasn't behind it. Meadows believes this is straight out of the order, though. Stir up anti-mechanical resentment. She also knows Juliet didn't ask to go outside. Bernard keeps mum. After Bernard gets her measurements, Meadows orders him not to return until he has her suit. Damn. Later, Juliet tells Solo, even though he's closed the eye slit in the vault, that she could get to level 23 if she creates an apparatus to pump air for her while she swims underwater. She admits she'll need Solo to run said apparatus while she's submerged. Solo remains silent. Juliet pivots, stating she understands he's lost everyone in his life. He's traumatized. She thanks him for the food and turns to leave. Solo calls after her, asking what she'll do next. She'll figure it out. Meanwhile, Dr. Nichols learns that the woman he met earlier must think her birth control was removed. However, the powers that be don't want her to have children. He performs the procedure on the woman while her husband is there for support. They thank him for his help. Instead of keeping the birth control in and showing them the fake one, Nichols legitimately removes the woman's birth control. I love this act of defiance from him. Finally, Solo emerges from the vault and follows Juliet. He almost crosses the bridge with Juliet's help, but panics, scooting backward in terror. He claims this is the farthest he's been from the vault. Juliet reaches out to steady him. He realizes she's real. She's actually real. They sit in silence together. 4th episode begins as Solo is bursting with excitement over his new buddy, trying to strike up a conversation about his favorite things from the before time. For her part, Juliet meets Solo's enthusiasm with distracted irritation. As she scribbles calculations on an old classroom chalkboard, brainstorming ways to survive a dive into the silo's flooded levels, Solo takes in all the markers of lost childhood that surround them. Name tags written in sloppy handwriting, a mother's hand-knitted blanket. Somber, he reminisces about the nice girl he sat next to in school, but gets cagey with Juliet asks what caused his scarred eye. The two successfully put their heads together long enough to maneuver random parts into a makeshift underwater oxygen tube, but not before Solo almost dashes back to the vault, overwhelmed by a compulsive need to double-check its safety. It's our first glimpse at just how much Solo's solitude has scarred him. Juliet's underwater dive gets interrupted just inches away from her goal, a supply closet, when part of her contraption proves too wide to fit through a narrow opening. Having just managed to avoid drowning, she breaks open a metal storage locker with her bare hands before swimming back to Solo. As soon as her head breaks the water's surface, Solo flees back to the vault and locks himself back inside its safety. He's so rattled that he enters the wrong password and almost locks himself outside, which prompts him to suspect Juliet of tampering with the vault behind his back, even though they never left one another's sides. Juliet tries and fails to reignite their conversation. She didn't realize how comforting Solo's chatter was, or how much she would miss the compassionate company until he meets her own monologue with cold silence. Said speech is one of Ferguson's best scenes in the series to date, as Solo's resilient, exhausted heroine admits how frightened, lonely, yet relieved she was when she went out to clean. It's only when Juliet stands up to leave, wiping away intermittent tears, that Solo timidly peeks his head around the open vault door. Their timid peace appears to be reestablished, and with it, hopefully, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Over in Silo 18, Knox and Shirley resume their incomplete conversation about the wall of names in the Down Deep. After discovering hidden messages among the countless names, Knox suspects that a rebellion happens once every generation, and the names belong to mechanical workers who died during the uprisings as either protesters or scapegoats. Determined to get the truth from leadership but wary of making any so-called aggressive moves, the pair agree to the most risk-averse plan they can think of. As head of mechanical, Knox can request a meeting with Judge Meadows, who might be more sympathetic to their cause than Mayor Bernard Holland. Off-screen, Meadows accepts Knox's request, and to say it doesn't go over well is an understatement. Sims worries that Meadows is letting the Down Deepers get too close and voices his reservations with Holland. Bernard sides with Meadows, prompting Sims to quietly turn public sentiment against the judge. If enough citizens demand her impeachment, then Holland might be cowed enough to start favoring Sims' advice once again. Over in Judicial, Paul Billings's wife frets about the dangerous mob from Mechanical making the long hike upstairs. Said mob consists of Knox, Shirley, Martha Walker, and Carla. The latter two take a breather on a bench and reflect on the years they wasted, thanks in large part to Martha's self-isolating fear. Knox, sitting nearby on an opposing bench, smiles at the ex-couple's intimate moment before striking up an equally vulnerable conversation with Shirley. If Meadows agrees with their suggestion to send scouts outside the silo, both of them would volunteer. Before these two can grow any closer, however, a sheriff's deputy arrives to escort them the rest of the way. The order comes straight from Billings, who's concerned about their safety from the increasingly violent protesters up top, but too busy investigating the firebomb attack that took Cooper's life, which looks more and more like an inside job. Meadows, meanwhile, meets with Lucas Kyles at his request. If you'll recall, Kyle played a key role in Juliet's investigation last season, a kindness that's come back to bite him in the form of a 10-year sentence to the mines. Surprisingly, when Kyle asks why Meadows agreed to his request for a hearing review, they bond over their hunger for the stars and the outside world's other mysteries. It's a short-lived moment, however. Meadows remits Kyle's sentence to 5 years and brusquely dismisses him to the sounds of a crowd chanting for her impeachment right outside her window. Incensed, Meadows charges into Holland's office, whose desk happens to be covered with impeachment demands from the public. He insists the movement isn't his doing. But what did she expect? Even if she's taking these meetings to make the silo's leadership look fair, extending kindness to Mechanical frightens the more privileged, higher-level residents. Holland then invites Meadows to dinner, incentivizing the offer with the promise of her environmental suit. The moment couldn't feel more ominous, and our worst fears are confirmed when Holland slips a fast-acting poison into her food. He cites his need to obey the order at any cost, and her death will be the perfect storm necessary to unite everyone against Mechanical. Tears streaming down her face, stumbling over her words in a rush, Meadows asks what Holland did with the hard drive Juliet found in Season 1. Holland claims he destroyed it. Unfortunate for him, since it contained a coded letter from Salvador Quinn, the head of IT during the last rebellion 140 years earlier. Instead of sharing what the letter said, Meadows uses her last moments to set free the truth she's withheld for 25 years. She didn't resign as Holland's shadow because she sought freedom from his clutches, but because she knew Holland could never love her more than the order. The admission strikes Holland like a blow to the gut. His final mercy, as it were, is placing the silo equivalent of a VR headset over Meadows' eyes. Holland knows the footage by heart, a biological research reserve in Costa Rica dated 2018, and he guides Meadows through the images, telling her when and where to look and the name of each wondrous animal she's observing. As soothed as any murder victim can be, Meadows' last words are a chillingly relevant query. What did they do, Bernard? How did they lose this world? Even though it's a profound shame to lose this character right when she was flourishing, Meadows' demise feels inevitable. Holland would never have set her free, no matter how gently he cradles her deceased body. Moody and Robbins have always been each other's best scene partners, and this heart-wrenching exchange marks their best silo performances to date. Some undetermined time later, Knox, Shirley, Martha, and Carla arrive outside Judicial HQ only to be denied entry. Carla reaches into her bag and drops a red ball all the way down into Mechanical. Once it hits, Mechanical shuts down the power grid and plunges the building into darkness. Holland offers them access if they turn the lights back on. Cue Carla dropping the green ball to cue just that, in what's quite the flex of the Down Deeper's inherent power. With an ugly smile, Holland escorts Knox and Shirley inside. Upon finding Meadows' dead body slumped in her desk chair, a knife embedded in her chest, they instantly realize they've been set up. Holland lets them leave before he orders Sims to keep them from gaining too much of a head start, and makes it clear he knows Sims orchestrated the push to impeach Meadows and resents Sims for forcing his hand. Wearing quite the "if it isn't the consequence of my own actions" expression, Sims riles up the protesters by pinning Meadows' murder on Mechanical, stoking their fear and calling for bloodlust-tinged justice. Knox, Shirley, Martha, and Carla do have the tiniest head start, racing down the spiral stairs as fast as they can, but the only real mob in the silo is right on their heels. Fifth episode begins as Shirley, Knox, Martha, and Carla are on the run, and they know they can't avoid their angry pursuers forever. Short on options, Carla uses her connections with the porters to gain a temporary hiding spot. She also has her eyes on their illegally obtained descender rig, a powered winch and cable system. Just when it feels like they've secured a much-needed win, Knox spots a group of raiders zeroing in on their current location. The porters turned in our Down Deep quartet in exchange for the considerable bounty on their heads. Carla, concerned that her health conditions place the others in unnecessary jeopardy, insists that everyone go their separate ways. Knox and Shirley flee, as does Martha, despite her intentions to stay by her ex-wife's side. Mechanical needs Martha more than ever, Carla advises, and in the fight against Joint Judicial, Martha has the benefit of anonymity on her side, unlike Carla, whose capture is inevitable. Knowing they might never see each other again, Martha seizes Carla in a remorse-filled kiss. In the safety of their quarters, Robert, Sims, and Camille wonder if it's possible to retroactively conceal Robert's involvement in the impeachment campaign against the late Judge Meadows. Their quarters, however, aren't that safe after all. Following a worried exclamation from their son, the Sims discover Bernard Holland making coffee in their kitchen. During the tense conversation that follows, Holland tries to gauge the extent of Camille's role in the impeachment. Whether he sees through her obfuscation isn't clear, but it doesn't feel promising. Once the artificial pleasantries are dispensed with, Holland fires Sims from his post as head of judicial security and destroys any hope Robert had of becoming the mayor's successor. But Robert is too valuable to entirely get rid of, and Meadows' death left a vacancy. So, just like that, we have Judge Sims. Down in the sheriff's station, Paul Billings and Deputy Hank both feel torn between their personal and professional lives. For Hank, it's the tension between believing in Knox, Shirley, Martha, and Carla's innocence despite judicial labeling them murderers and fugitives. Billings responds to Hank's honesty with his own vulnerability. He reveals his syndrome diagnosis, a disease forbidden by the same laws Billings vows to uphold. Together, the duo suss out Patrick Kennedy's location. He's sitting in a dark, dreary tunnel, bleeding from the bullet he sustained from tossing the firebomb in Episode 3. Kennedy isn't interested in helping Billings' quest for answers, until Paul hands him the poster of the Blue Ridge Mountains that Billings found in Juliette's apartment. Kennedy promises the truth in exchange for a doctor. Speaking of doctors, Pete Nichols and Kathleen Billings exchange introductions after they clock the other, tending to wounded citizens outside Judicial HQ. It's a brief conversation, since two raiders zip Pete over to Holland's office. The mayor gives Pete his daughter's sheriff's badge and other personal affects. Under normal circumstances, Holland explains they would go back into circulation. But having them out in the open might encourage Mechanical's rebellious sentiments. Pete takes Juliette's things, but makes it crystal clear he's doing so because he's a grieving father, not because he fears the consequences if he disobeyed. After losing his entire family to the silo's machinations and pretending to remove dozens of birth control implants over the years, he has nothing left to lose. Holland glares after Pete with such wild-eyed ferocity. His face almost twitches. Meanwhile, an incensed group of civilians halts Shirley and Knox's sprint down the stairs. A rough scuffle quickly breaks out, but Camille's timely intervention ends the altercation just as fast. She pretends to arrest Knox and Shirley, citing her authority as an ex-raider, before stashing them inside a janitorial closet where they can lie low for a few hours. She also tips them off about the barricade on level 130, but refuses to explain why she's suddenly helping the rebellion. Said rebellion's leaders rest for a few hours, then pull a fast one on the new head of security, Rick Amundsen. They retrace their steps back up the stairs and steal the descender rig from the porters. Shirley and Knox secure one side of the rig's cable to the stair railing, tie themselves to the other end, and leap straight down the main chute while holding hands. The cable is just long enough to drop them past the barricade and into friendly territory. Thanks to some down deepers hauling them back over the railing, they emerge relatively unscathed, prompting Holland, who's watching everything from inside his camera room, to drop the best delivery of that I've heard in a while. That said, not every power play Holland makes in this episode blows up in his face. Bernard retrieves a perplexed Lucas Kyle from the mines and tasks him with fixing the hard drive Juliet discovered last season. True to Holland's last words with Meadows before her death, he had indeed smashed the drive. But now that he knows it contains a coded note from Salvador Quinn, a controversial figure from the last rebellion, he's in a pickle. If Kyle can put his pattern-recognizing brain to good use, then he might just prove himself valuable enough to earn his 5-year sentence a permanent reprieve. After Juliet and Solo's reconciliation last week, history is repeating itself. Their agendas are too different, and their tentative alliance too unstable as a result. By Solo's calculations, he has 10 months before the water from the flooded generator reaches the IT level and compromises whatever he's protecting inside the vault. He wants Juliet to fix the silo's broken pump, citing her engineering expertise. Juliet vehemently disagrees. Saving the 10,000 vulnerable lives in her silo is more time-sensitive than his vault. Their dispute doesn't preclude Solo from racing to grab Juliet some food when she doubles over from a nasty pain in her side. Nor does Juliet's discomfort keep her from shuffling through closed storage drawers in a nearby room. She finds a personnel directory as well as a note about a stolen helmet, the very thing she needs to finish assembling her new environmental suit. Looking for this helmet means exploring the apartment of Trina Samuels, where Juliet makes an unpleasant discovery: a framed photo of Tina and her boyfriend Solo, who bears no resemblance to the man Juliet knows. When Solo returns with food, she confronts him about his lies. He erupts into a screaming session so intense, "I am the real IT shadow." Juliet shies away from him before booking it down the hallway. A different room produces the helmet, and not a moment too soon. Sweating and groaning, her arm wound turning black from an infection, Juliet falls unconscious on the floor. Sixth episode opens with a group of down deepers clustered outside the titular barricade on level 130. The raiders on the other side are glaring up a storm, but the deepers continue to fearlessly chant, "Let them through," a phrase referring to the routine deliveries that Holland has withheld in retaliation for Shirley and Knox's escape last week, and as a psychological manipulation tactic. Watching the chaos from his room full of security screens, Holland smugly declares, "Only 9 missed meals separate a functioning society from chaos." If he's adapting, then Mechanical needs to match him, especially once Shirley and Knox discover that someone laced their food with rat poison. Needless to say, the rat poison news doesn't go over well with the rest of Mechanical. Knox and Shirley try to address their fellow residents' concerns, but the everyday people living through the side effects of this rebellion have no interest in letting their children starve to prove a point. As things grow increasingly hostile, it's once again down to Martha to verbally knock some sense into everyone else. The down deep turning on each other is exactly what Holland wants, she points out. The only reward judicial will dispense for their continued obedience is a pat on the head. Her arguments start to sway the gathering, but Teddy turns the tide by wheeling in a barrow full of fresh food from the farmers on level 122. Enclosed among the produce is a note of solidarity from Mechanical's neighbors, signed with a definitive, Juliet lives. Holland, the five-dimensional chess player that he is pleased to hear that Mechanical's allies are already smuggling food down the chute. He can squash this revolution more quickly than he anticipated. Unbeknownst to him, however, Shirley, Knox, and Teddy are strategizing their next steps. What happens when they need another delivery and 122's generosity can't slip past Holland's beady eyes a second time? The answer? Forcibly move the barricade up a few levels. One team will drill up through the floor, while a second group, led by Knox and armed with some custom-made weapons he requested, distract the raiders' attention. The latter point certainly works like a charm. The appearance of armed civilians sends Rick Amundsen into a panicked tizzy. Meanwhile, Sheriff Paul Billings asks his wife Kathleen to discreetly send a doctor down to operate on a very surly Patrick Kennedy. Kathleen approaches Pete Nichols, and after some crafty improvisation, she gets both of them through the barricade without incident. Similarly, Pete extracts the bullet from Kennedy without a hitch. But once his health is out of the woods, Patrick turns cagey about fulfilling his end of this mutually beneficial arrangement. Billings looks almost ready to unravel as he threatens to reveal Kennedy's location to the recently appointed Judge Sims, a staffing shakeup of which Kennedy wasn't aware. The man relents, spilling the beans about the beautiful footage from the before times that Juliet broadcast onto their computers in Season 1, as well as the deal he struck with Sims to toss a firebomb in exchange for Kennedy's freedom. Over in IT, Holland visits his division, specifically Camille Sims' desk. Ever so politely, he interrogates her about her role in Knox and Shirley's escape, claiming that she disrupted justice. Camille argues that she followed protocol as a former ranger and doesn't meld. Holland remember that so-called vigilante justice goes against the pact, even though she holds her own against Bernard. The encounter leaves her shaken enough to lead a team of backup raiders down to the barricade. By that point, however, she's too late to prevent Mechanical's plan. Their drill breaches the floor from below and tears down the barricade. Shirley and Knox chase after the fleeing raiders before the two groups have a standoff on level 120. The raiders relent, letting Mechanical gain 10 extra levels, including the farm complex on 122, an advantage that prevents Holland from starving them into submission. Knox and Shirley celebrate by enjoying a drink and some kissing. I knew that chemistry was going somewhere. Before Billings interrupts. After they metaphorically swear on the pact that Holland and Sims set them up to take the fall for Judge Meadows' murder, Billings radios Holland to announce he's opening a full investigation into Meadows' death, among other glaring inconsistencies. Stunned yet somehow resigned, Holland kills the radio before gifting us with another delightfully delivered expletive. F me, I just lost the sheriff. Billings, for his part, would disagree with that sentiment. Even though his faith in judicial is shaken, a shift that's been a long time coming, he hasn't sided with the rebels. His devotion to the pact compels him to investigate the accusations against Holland. After saying as much to Kathleen, she asks him to pass a water glass across their cafeteria table. When she doesn't take the glass from his hand, making her husband hold it instead, Kathleen notes that he isn't shaking, even though he also just admitted to going days without the herbs that reduce his syndrome symptoms. Back in her quarters, Martha relives her emotional last moments with Carla before they parted ways last week. She refuses to back up Knox and Shirley's account of Meadows' murder until Billings can tell her where Carla is and whether she's still alive. Billings suspects that Holland locked Carla in seclusion after her arrest. Her health conditions put a ticking clock on her survival, and the best chance Billings has of freeing her is if he can clear her of those murder charges. Later on, Pete and Martha exchange a few kind words when he unexpectedly drops by her workroom. He thanks her for taking care of Juliet, which includes Martha sneaking Juliet the quality tape, i.e., the only reason that Pete's daughter walked out of that crater alive. That said, Martha doesn't think Juliet survived. She gave her girl that tape so Juliet wouldn't spend the last minutes of her life knowing that everyone she cared about was watching her die on that hill. Juliet herself doesn't make it too far this week, but at least she's conscious after almost dying from an infected wound. She wakes up in the same room with Solo, who saved her life by treating her with his homemade antibiotics. That, however, is the extent of Solo's generosity. He's hidden her environmental suit and refuses to return it until Juliet fixes the generator's broken pump. And he won't hear another word on the subject. Circling back to Holland, the mayor has a rare moment of vulnerability when he privately visits Meadows' corpse in the morgue. A one-sided conversation ensues, complete with a grieving Bernard clutching her hand and weeping. He confesses that he can't stomach the thought of their 140-year-long peace falling apart on his watch, and apologizes for having to factor her death into his calculations, a cold comfort at this point. As part of those calculations, he checks in on Lucas Kyle's progress decoding Salvador Quinn's hidden message. Both men agree that Quinn used a sophisticated cipher, but Kyle's limited security clearance has his hands tied. Deciding that Kyle's intuition needs access to something called the Legacy, Holland swears Kyle in as his new shadow, officially turning the man who dreamed about the stars into the mayor's right-hand man. 7th episode starts with Bernard bringing Lucas into a secret room, promising that he's going to see something that only a few people have had access to in the past. As he unlocks the door and invites him in, he finds himself in a strange room. Lucas is verified as the Shadow, and he's told to familiarize himself with the Legacy. Following Bernard, he's shown a room full of relics from the old world. There's a star constellation, books, and even pictures. Everything Lucas can see is also stored digitally, too, on an iPad. Bernard actually looked for answers when he first discovered all of this, and the only thing he learned was that the silo was created 350 years ago, but nothing about why they're here. They need to break Salvador's code, but Bernard warns that this knowledge is worse than the rebellion itself. It could destroy everything. Meanwhile, Knox and Shirley work together, rallying the troops and preparing to strike back against the authorities in the silo. Part of that comes from sending a rocket up high into the silo, which explodes in midair and sends out numerous slips of paper. What's on this paper? Well, the notes demand answers over why IT is lying and exactly how Meadows died. This is then followed up by Knox and Shirley shutting off power completely, save for IT, which is done intentionally to turn the mob against them, just like Bernard did to Mechanical. It's an ingenious move, all things considered, and it sees Bernard scrambling for refuge. He gets nowhere when he tries to bargain with Carla, while Camille decides Sims should wait for Bernard to come to him so they can work on their own terms and get to the bottom of this IT malarkey. Bernard shows up to see Carla and demands to know about the gunpowder that Mechanical have. Carla tries to drive a hard bargain, but it doesn't work with Bernard, who eventually walks away and briefs the police, telling them that Paul has been held hostage and forced into saying what he did. For now, all radio communication has been disabled. He points out that they're under attack and tells them all to keep the peace. While Judicial will take over anything rebellion-related. Naturally, this causes friction among all of the officers. Speaking of Paul, he learns about the plot for poisoning the food and where those orders are coming from. Apparently, there's been another note come through with the new plan being to kill both Knox and Shirley. Paul decides to bring them into custody for their own safety. Elsewhere, Bernard marches in to see Sims and demands his search warrant. However, Sims has the high ground here and he refuses. He's given years of his life to the silo and is shocked when he finds out Lucas is his new shadow. In fact, Bernard continues and brings up that Camille is the reason the rebels escaped before eventually turning and leaving. Down in Mechanical, Shirley desperately tries to get a message sent over to Judicial Seclusion, where Carla is. She's adamant she needs to do more for her, but the others believe this is a lost cause. Very few, if any, of the souls that end up in seclusion have made it back. In the cafeteria, the group find out that one of their own, May, was forced into poisoning the food. She was blackmailed, with her mum's health hanging in the balance. Knox warns that she's going to be given some tough jobs going forward, and probably a bit of grief from the others, but she's not being sent to the mines. Lucas returns to Bernard, having seemingly cracked the cipher. Turns out they're numbers, not letters, and one in particular, 77. In order to validate all of this and find out what it means, they need a book that's over 140 years ago. And Bernard has just what they need in a book called The Wizard of Oz. Sims speaks to Camille about her letting Knox and Shirley escaping, and he's not happy. He sees this as a betrayal, but Camille believes they need to play both sides. Sims, though, demands that they no longer keep secrets from one another. Meanwhile, Juliet preps herself for the dive. She gets some waterproof wire, but she needs to be careful. Solo explains that Juliet needs to be brought back up slowly given the pressure, but she doesn't believe him. That is, until Solo pleads with his life, pointing out that he needs help to prevent him from messing everything up. His piteous display is enough for Juliet to agree, but she's not happy about it. She descends down into the deep and works with Solo to try and get the generator working. Unfortunately, everything goes awry when the tubing fails, and Juliet finds herself scrambling for air. She rushes up and just about makes it, although it's definitely touch and go for a while. However, there are more alarming matters at hand here. When Juliet returns to the levels above water, she finds spatters of blood, and Solo is nowhere to be found. It would appear that there's someone else in this silo with them. But who? As the episode closes out, we cut back to Bernard one more time. He realizes that he can use Martha's relationship with Carla as collateral and make her betray the others in Mechanical. Episode 8's events in the Down Deep start on a solemn note, with Shirley adding the late Cooper's name to Mechanical's wall of names of other revolutionaries who died in previous rebellions. Then, she joins Sheriff Paul Billings for breakfast in the cafeteria. The pair discuss the founder's idea of due process, which has both virtues and flaws, and the inarguable fact that true justice will never be achieved as long as the pact and the people upholding it, like Bernard Holland and Robert Sims, are in control. Sometime later, when Billings is alone with his wife, Kathleen, Shirley's argument against the pact sticks with Billings's increasingly conflicted conscience. Together, the couple cry over the old picture of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a relic from Juliet's room that Billings still hasn't discarded. In the uptop, Lucas Kyle uses his newfound authority as the mayor's shadow to search the late Judge Meadows' apartment. Kyle consults her book collection and realizes he needs a specific text if he wants to crack Salvador Quinn's message. Quinn's old copy of the Pact, something Quinn's descendants have kept safe and passed down since the rebellion 140 years ago. Kyle visits Quinn's current living descendant, Terrence Penbrook, and tries to strong-arm the man, as well as his daughter-in-law and grandson, into surrendering the book. To say that Kyle screws the pooch is an understatement. Penbrook doesn't trust Kyle as far as he can throw him, and Quinn's actions during the rebellion stained his family's name. His descendants have spent those 140 years trying to make up for his actions. Kyle returns to judicial with his metaphorical tail between his legs. Holland, however, doesn't seem upset about this bump in the road. He explains that Quinn, letting the rebels wipe the servers and burn all the books, was actually a heroic act on Quinn's part. Quinn himself erased all the information about past rebellions, and without examples to look up to, the silo's residents weren't inspired to keep resisting. Quinn also put a memory-erasing drug in the water supply, guaranteeing that anyone who remembered the uprisings would forget over time. As for Mechanical, they made the perfect scapegoat to hide behind. As far as we know, Holland, and now Kyle, by extension, is the only person who knows the truth about Quinn and the several centuries' worth of rebellions. Chastened, Kyle apologizes to Penbrook's family. He tells them Quinn was a hero who saved the silo, and because Meadows visited long enough to tell them the same thing before she became a judge, the Penbrooks believe him. They produce Quinn's old copy of the pact, and Lucas manages to translate the message's first sentence. If you've gotten this far, you already know the game is rigged. When Lucas leaves to report his progress to Holland, who's waiting for him right outside his door, none other than Robert Sims. Earlier in this episode, Camille had exploited Rick Amundsen's guilt about replacing Sims as head of judicial security. Amundsen reported Kyle's location to Sims, but promised no more favors. Sims absconds with Quinn's pact, complete with an ominous warning to Kyle to not trust Holland. If anyone has first-hand experience of how easily the mayor tosses aside those loyal to him, it would be Robert Sims. Checking in with Mechanical, Martha makes one last-ditch plea for them to adjust their priorities. Rescuing Carla from seclusion should be top of mind. Martha's beloved ex-wife can only last so long, given her health conditions. Shirley is far from unsympathetic to her friend's plight, but the group unanimously favors breaking into medical supply to restock their dwindling supplies. All Martha gets in response are platitudes and an anonymous message about fixing a pump on level 90. She immediately ascends, apparently not caring one whit that it's the most obvious trap in the world. She enters level 90's utility room to find Bernard patiently waiting for her. With little ceremony and no negotiation whatsoever, Holland threatens to keep Carla alive but torture her relentlessly unless Martha becomes a mole for him. Guilt-stricken, heartbroken, and backed into a corner, Martha agrees. As it turns out, becoming Holland's spy means revealing Mechanical's plans to raid medical supply. Amundsen and the raiders catch Teddy and a small rebel group in the act and promptly arrest them at gunpoint. But all Holland affords Martha in exchange is a glimpse of Carla through the seclusion room's vision slit. And it's a harrowing sight. Carla slumped in a chair, bound, blindfolded, and her hearing so muffled she can't hear Martha desperately crying out to her. Holland warns Martha that if she tries to weasel her way around her end of this not bargain, his spies in the down deep will know, and he will retaliate accordingly against Carla. Holland also orders Martha to stay in her workshop and reinstall the surveillance camera she briefly reconnected in last week's episode, a decision that's come back to horrifically haunt her. This turn of events hurts all the more when a concerned Shirley checks up on Martha and tells her about Teddy's arrest. Shirley knows they must have a snitch, but doesn't seem to ever consider it could be Martha, their voice of reason and fiercest leader. Jumping ship over to Juliet, who emerged from Silo 17's flooded depths to find a trail of blood, a hand axe on the ground, and no sign of Solo. The engineer has armed herself with that axe and slowly ascends the stairs. The first sign of trouble is a ringing in her ears, swiftly followed by Juliet repeatedly stumbling from a nasty cramp in her thigh that won't go away no matter how hard she beats her fist into her leg. Remembering that Solo told her the only cure for decompression sickness is to rest in the water until she feels normal again, Juliet abandons her search and sinks as deep underwater as she can, hanging onto the edge of a rope and occasionally drawing oxygen from her mouthpiece. Once she recovers, Juliet resumes following the blood trail. She calls out, and a person in the shadows responds by claiming they killed Solo. They warn Juliet that the same fate will befall her if she doesn't leave. Of course, Juliet doesn't obey a rando stranger's commands, and they promptly shoot an arrow into her chest. Our heroine retreats to a supply room, applying antibiotics and a bandage to her gnarly wound as best as she can with one hand. Undeterred, she grabs both a makeshift shield and a spear. Several floors up, a body lies on the floor covered with a sheet. Juliet carefully approaches, and the playing dead body attacks her as soon as she's within range. During the ensuing scuffle, Juliet rips the figure's helmet off to reveal a dark-haired boy of indeterminable age, but likely in his late teens or early 20s. Two more strangers, a girl and another boy, suddenly appear on the stairs above. And the girl is aiming a bow and arrow, ready to shoot Juliet in the heart. Ninth episode begins with us looking over at these scavengers. Turns out they've been here all along, and have been watching Juliet since she arrived in the silo. They have a child too, and in the background have been fixing up armor and weapons, believing her to be dangerous. Funnily enough, these guys have been sabotaging Juliet this whole time, including cutting the rope earlier in the season to make her fall in the water. One of the guys, Rick, actually threw her an empty container, which she used as a flotation device to stop herself drowning. The others, when they find out, are not happy. The trio see Solo head out from the vault and decide together that they need to kill him. Apparently he's a killer, and this catches us up to what happened last episode. Solo held his own against Rick, but he's saved by one of the women, who shoots Solo in the back with an arrow. After knocking him out and leaving him for dead, Rick decides they should keep him alive. He has a whole stockpile of food in the vault, and they need to get in there. Leaving him bleeding, Rick and the women head upstairs and take Solo, needing to get the code for the vault from him. Audrey is not happy, though, especially when she finds out that the blood trail could lead Juliet right to them. Well, as we know, it leads to the standoff at the end of the previous episode. The group decide to bargain, needing the food from the vault. Audrey decides that Juliet has as much time as it takes for her babe to cry again, and if she hasn't worked a solution by then, fake Solo is going to be killed, and with it, all of her stuff gone. Juliet unwittingly has the help of the girl called Eater, and together they work to get the code to the vault. Juliet does, however, find something inside a bag in a closet, which we find out later in the episode is actually another suit to make it outside. The real answers, though, appear to be found in the classroom, where all those numbers up on the blackboard now make perfect sense. It turns out this was left behind by those trying to get into the vault. Furthermore, the truth around the rebellion in this silo now starts to take shape. This happened a long, long time ago, and Solo, whose real name is actually Jimmy, was just a kid back then. This gives Juliet reason to speak to Jimmy, who's at least lucid and awake. He brings up that Russell was the one who entrusted him with keeping the vault safe. He swore an oath, but he wasn't the Shadow. He was Russell's son. Understanding this, time unfortunately runs out as Audrey's child begins crying. However, Rick stands in the way too and makes her stand down, knowing that there's more going on here. Jimmy was asleep the whole time, where people broke into the vault, and he trapped them inside, destroying the inside handle. In order to prove the validity of his story, he shows off the scar on the side of his chest. Jimmy has been haunted by the death of his father, who was killed right in front of his face for not opening the vault. Eventually they manage to get inside, where we see how beautiful the inside of this vault actually is. There are pictures up everywhere, along with paper birds, old relics, and a separate room full of food like ice cream. Interestingly, there's also an old relic room, just like in our silo, full of various trinkets. Jimmy shows off a suit he's been keeping safe all this time, and apologizes for not telling her sooner. Despite finding a suit, Juliet decided she didn't want to leave because she found solace with Jimmy and wanted to help him. In our vault, Lucas realizes that there are 51 different silos in total. He speaks to Bernard about this, who admits that yes, Juliet did make it to another silo. Apparently all IT heads and their shadows know about the silos, but this isn't what Quinn was hiding. So as a result, he needs to continue. Lucas does just that, and finds further evidence that he needs to investigate, stemming from the tunnel at the bottom of the silo. He'll get his confirmation there. Before he leaves, he heads back to see his mum and tries to get her to hide the pact. Paul realizes he was used as sheriff and not put into that position because of his credentials. He decides that he needs to help the rebels, and it could well be that all deputies will join the ranks, but Paul isn't sure. Knox, though, knows that there is someone up top they can use on their side, Camille Sims. Unfortunately, Knox shows up and spills everything they have so far, including the sheriff being on their side, right in view of the camera, which Bernard is watching. He wants to know the extent of Mechanical's plan, and that puts Martha in a tricky position, especially if she ever wants to see Carla again. Bernard continues his tirade, speaking to those in IT and spinning the tale that the latest raid from Mechanical was not for medical supplies, but actually to obtain gunpowder to blast open the vault doors. Bernard spins this to pin the plan on Paul Billings, and Bernard strips him of his sheriff badge. Not only that, but they're also going to be turning the cafeteria into a jail cell. Lucas heads down to Mechanical and pleads with Shirley to let him pass. He thinks Juliet is still alive and promises to show her, if she works with him to find out the truth. Meanwhile, Paul speaks to Sims and tries to work with him, explaining that the line for what's right and just has moved. He hands over the old relic, the slip of paper, and explains that he has no choice but to trust him to do the right thing. He speaks to Camille after seeing the old relic, and they realize the answers they seek could well be in the server room. Knox returns to Martha and reveals that he's figured out who the traitor is. He believes it's Teddy's mum. He's going to change the game, and part of that stems from using the rest of the gunpowder. Of course, he's completely unaware that through all of this, Bernard is listening to everything. Elsewhere, Shirley and Lucas head down to the depths of the silo. Just before they dive into the water, Lucas brings up that Juliet could still be alive, given her helmet showed her make it to the other silo. The thing is, the water is only up to his knees, and nowhere near as deep as he initially thought. Chuckling in relief, Lucas heads into the tunnel, determined to find out the truth. As he steps inside, a voice booms that he will need to follow the directives, otherwise the safeguard will be initiated. He agrees to play along, and as he utters the words "I do," the episode comes to an eerie end. 10th episode opens by returning to Juliet's father, Pete, as Shirley conveys the bombshell that Juliet's survival might be more probable than metaphorical. From their perspective, it's still a frail hope, even going off Lucas Kyle's information, but it's the best incentive they have to keep fighting. Shirley, Pete, Knox, and Paul Billings meet in Martha's workshop and lay out their plans for a last-ditch assault on the up top. If the rebels can hold off the raiders for 3 hours, that gives them enough time to hold the generator room hostage. Either Holland tells them the truth, or they blow up the generator itself. Bernard Holland, hearing everything courtesy of Martha's surveillance camera, orders the entire raiding team to arrest the rebels and secure the generator. Dozens of raiders swarm through the barricade into the down deep, and despite Mechanical charging into battle with their homemade weapons, the fight doesn't seem to last long. Everyone, including Patrick Kennedy and Lucas Kyle, the latter happened to be booking it up from the ground level at precisely the wrong time, finds themselves locked inside one of the up top's cafeterias, which the sheriff's deputies altered into a prison on Holland's orders. From above, power couple Robert and Camille Sims watch the arrests and wonder if they chose the wrong side. It's too late to go back now, however, especially if Bernard discovers that the Sims passed along Billings' message. Presumably, the picture of the Blue Ridge Mountains responsible for causing several characters' internal crises. Once the coast has cleared, Raider Jean escorts Pete and a severely wounded colleague of hers, who's conveniently lying underneath a sheet, past some stationed raiders. Said raiders respond to a panic-sounding call from the generator room and find it's already been laced with explosives. The wires aren't connected to the bomb, but they still need to guard the area. Simultaneously, Jean, Pete, and the anonymous figure sprint away in the opposite direction. Once they arrive at a designated point on the stairs, Jean monitors the ascending path for stragglers while Deputy Hank, the body under the sheet, makes a quick reconnaissance check in the opposite direction. He returns to find Pete shaken. They dropped and lost a timer in their rush. Someone must manually detonate the explosives they smuggled down with Hank. His decision already made, Pete removes Juliet's watch from his wrist and hands it to Hank, telling the other man to pass along his loving affirmations to Juliet. Meanwhile, Rick Amundsen separates the rebellion's followers in the cafeteria from its leaders. Knox, Shirley, and Billings are locked into traditional cells, and Amundsen makes a show of freeing Carla while exposing Martha as the mole. Carla expresses visceral disgust with her ex-wife's apparent betrayal, choosing to stay in a cell. Martha leaves to meet with Holland, who gloats as much as you'd expect while he watches the clock wind down on Mechanical's rebellion. However, back in the main holding area, Deputy Molly Cairns frees Billings and the others, telling her boss that they got his message. Back in IT, Martha takes her time before dropping some mechanical lore on Bernard. Because the generator runs so loudly, she explains, the division learned to communicate through hand signals. The same ones she's been using since day one to tell her allies the truth about Holland blackmailing her. Martha watches the clock, smirking and counting down to 0 from 5 seconds. Cut to Pete, who gives one last kind look up at a stricken Hank watching him from one level above, before triggering the explosives. Bernard and Amundsen find the stairs between levels 90 and 92 destroyed, leaving the rebellion prisoners above the explosion point and every single raider trapped down below it. Said prisoners, now freed, armed, and backed by Billings deputies, march toward IT. Kyle, running for his life, beats them and beelines straight to Bernard. He orders the mayor to silently listen, citing how everyone will die if it hears Kyle sharing the forbidden information he's about to impart. The camera conveniently steps back from this moment, observing it from both Amundsen and Sims' perspectives. The audience doesn't hear Kyle's words, returning only for a close-up on Bernard's horrified expression as he grapples with the reason why Judge Meadows resigned as his shadow, and why Lucas is doing the same. Despairing, Bernard shuffles forward in a haze. He refuses to answer Sim's questions, instead making the man his shadow without any pomp or circumstance. Just the key and code necessary to enter the vault. Then, Holland retrieves a backpack from his quarters, silently slides into a room crowded with concerned residents, and fires off a gun 3 times, ordering everyone to leave the room. Over in Silo 17, Juliet, the Jimmy formerly known as Solo, and the rest of 17th's crew, Audrey, Rick, and Eater, who prefers her birth name, Hope, arrive at Jimmy's family quarters from before the rebellion. He remembers where his parents were standing like it was yesterday, and Jimmy reflects on how they were younger when they died than he is now. Finding a handwritten note reading safeguard procedures, however, shocks him out of his lingering poignancy. Racing to reunite with Juliet, he cites the safeguard as something that might help her save her silo. Desperately trying to piece together his decade-old memories, Jimmy finally exclaims, "The safeguard is a pipe." Before their deaths, his parents managed to cap the pipe before it pumped out enough poison to kill 10,000 people. Now more anxious to return home than ever, Juliet finds her homemade environmental suit eaten through and ruined by moths. Audrey immediately and illogically blames Hope, forcing Juliet to yell sense into the younger woman, which includes a lesson on survival. The only way to manage is to treasure the people you love. While she monologues, Jimmy absconds with the older suit and tests it by going into the flooded water on the lower levels. Since he didn't drown, the suit should be safe for her to wear outside. Jimmy flinches at the hug Juliet attempts at that moment. But later, once Juliet is suited up, he seeks delicate reassurance about whether she plans to come back. "Nothing will stop me from trying," Juliet promises. Jimmy initiates an awkward but deeply earnest hug. Shifting from besties to wives, Carla and Martha share a sweet reunion that's cut short by the other residents demanding to go outside. Their enthusiasm swiftly reaches mob levels. Led by Kennedy, they rage their way into the nearest kitchen and ransack it, using furniture as a barrier to hold back Knox, Billings, and the others trying to stop their impulsiveness. Paul manages to reach the locked room inside which Bernard has settled himself, begging the mayor to tell them the truth and begging the mob to listen to Holland. Unsatisfied, the crowd carries Paul away, but everyone pauses when, on the display screen, a figure crests the hill. Overjoyed cheers erupt when Juliet cleans the lens. Holland hears the crowd taking up the Juliet Lives chant and emerges to see her holding up a note warning them to stay inside. As this unfolds, Robert, Camille, and their son Anthony enter the vault. The same disembodied voice Lucas encountered in the tunnel last week asks their purpose. Robert wants to save the silo, and on that subject, the voice agrees, but selects Camille as the only person allowed to stay inside the vault. Outside, the doors open for Juliet after she tries to manually force them open, to no avail. She finds Bernard waiting for her, wearing an environmental suit and aiming a gun at her. As Juliet warily advances, Bernard admits he's given up after learning about the poison. His life's work is for nothing, and all he wants is to exert the little freedom he has by going outside. The contentious pair seems to have stumbled into a possible truce, but the door behind them starts closing. Juliet bolts forward. Bernard grabs her arm, shouting that she'll get burned. He gets dragged inside the room with her, and true to his word, flames shoot from the walls and fill the room. Cut to a rainy evening in contemporary-looking Washington, D.C. Daniel, a Georgia congressman, enters a restaurant and joins Helen at a booth. The pair swap awkward stories about where they were when a dirty bomb deployed. Wherever it struck, and whether Iran was truly the responsible party like they believe, the loss of life and the socio-political ramifications have been immense. Helen sought him out to discuss this radiological attack. Daniel was under the assumption this was a date. Ultimately, Daniel declines to answer Helen's questions and leaves, but not before giving her a gift he panic bought from the nearest convenience store. A Pez dispenser with a duck on the top, which we can only assume is the same relic we saw Anthony Sims playing with earlier in the season. What does all of that mean? We'll have to wait until Season 3.